Well, this week, the House of Representatives, in a bipartisan fashion, passed legislation that would ban TikTok from the United States if the company does not divest from a Chinese-owned company called ByteDance. There are security concerns about TikTok that have been raised over the last couple of years, as everyone knows by now. And joining me to talk about some of those concerns is Joe Carrigan. He is the senior security engineer with Johns Hopkins University Information Security Institute. Joe, thanks for joining me on the DC Debrief. How are you?
It's my pleasure, John. I'm doing well. Thank you.
Thank you. And so these security concerns, as I mentioned, are not new. People have had some concerns about ByteDance, the fact that they are owned by the Chinese. And can you just talk a little bit specifically about what are some of these security concerns? Because I know they go just beyond sharing data, right? I mean, with China, there's always that big bugaboo of the Chinese government taking your information.
Right. So one of the big concerns is that there's a requirement for Chinese companies to cooperate with the government. They don't have the same system of jurisprudence we have in the United States. Although there have been cases of American companies doing something very similar. But I think this more stems from, if you take a look, recently they also had Mark Zuckerberg and other social media CEOs on the floor in front of, I can't remember if it was some congressional body.
Yeah.
And the big scene there was Mark Zuckerberg getting up and apologizing to people. But the whole issue is that social media is, first off, remarkably manipulative of people in general. And it's not just ByteDance and TikTok that do this, but that concern is amplified when you start talking about having that outside of control, and that's what Congress is worried about here, particularly the House of Representatives are passing this law that says you got to divest yourself of this Chinese company, because we know that when that data leaves, if the Chinese government comes in and says, we need the data, you have to give it to them. It's not like the United States government coming in, we need this data for surveillance purposes of people, and the American company or the company saying to the American government, no, you're not going to get that without a warrant. So that's not even possible in China. So that's really what this concern is. Additionally, they are finding that there are bot networks run by the Chinese Communist Party on TikTok. Now, again, that's not unique to TikTok. That's been found on Twitter, or X now. That's been found on Facebook. The difference is that when Facebook identifies them, they go in and they shut them down. And I don't think that's happening at TikTok.
Okay, so it seems like there's two different lanes here. Let me tackle the first one that you mentioned, and that's the sharing of data. What kind of data are we talking about?
Actually, the data that's shared is not like specific location data, but it's not any worse than any other social networking platform. But still, that's a lot of data. I mean, the amount of data that Meta has about its users, and that Twitter has about it, or X has about its users, and even LinkedIn, which is more of a professional social network. That amount of data, if people actually understood how that data was collected and what that data is used for, they might not be so willing to be on these platforms in the first place. For example, Facebook keeps a model of every single user that's trained by their behavior. And after you've interacted with Facebook for a remarkably short time, and I think it's all of Meta's platforms actually, but particularly Facebook, they have a very good understanding of you, to the point where they may know more about you than your friends do. They know who your political affiliation is. They know what your gender is. They know about how old you are. They know, if you're a white person, black person, Hispanic person, they know that very quickly because these models are accurate. So imagine that under the control of potentially under the control of being exposed to a authoritarian government. That's really one of the big concerns.
Okay, so the other aspect of this is, of course, I think what you're talking about, deepfakes, AI, that kind of thing, where they're trying to maybe influence what's happening here in America, how Americans think about issues, and of course there are no shortage of things going on in the world that are there. There's
Right.
almost no safe place anymore, right? No, there are no opinions you can have that aren't controversial or certainly ripe for exploitation. So I mean,
Right.
it seems as though that's a real worry, especially as we're coming up here on the 2024 presidential election.
Yeah. Back in 2014, Pew Research released this report about political divisiveness in the United States. And it was, they had two graphs overlaid on two sections of data, and it was about the political alignment of Democrats and Republicans. And the center of both of those graphs were actually pretty close, right? So if you were a dead center Republican and a dead center Democrat, your opinions wouldn't be that far from each other. And that was true in 1994. It was true in 2004, but in 2014, that gap had widened a lot. I would like to see Pew Research release a study for 2024 to see if it's widened further. I would bet that it has. The reason for that, in my opinion, is and I think there's research out there. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but the reason for that is the social media divide. First off, people go into social media and they get in their own little echo chambers where they start hearing things. And there was Russian involvement in the 2020 election, and they're not just influencing the election. The goal with these operations is to increase that divide between Americans, because that's what's productive to American adversaries. So the Wall Street Journal had a great web page up for 3 years, from 2016 to 2019. They've since taken it down, and I really wish they hadn't. But it was called Red Feed, Blue Feed, where they had a Facebook user who was a Democrat, the Facebook user who was a Republican, and they saw that the Democrat would see inflammatory Democratic stories and the Republican would see inflammatory Republican stories, because, going back to these models, the goal of these models is to keep the user engaged, because that's their business model. The users are not the customers of this service, any social media service. They are the product. It's their eyes on the page that matters, because that's what gets the advertising dollars to come in. So when you see you can market almost exclusively to Democrats, you can market almost exclusively to Republicans, and you see that this kind of thing will happen. And then these adversarial governments, what they've done is they've realized, well, we can just get in here and manipulate this. Right. We can create a bunch of content that Republicans are going to look at and Democrats are going to want to look at. And they don't care about the authenticity of the media. All they want to do is enrage people and increase that further divide. So that's what these botnets are used for. And yeah, they use a lot of synthetic media. They may take a lot of things out of context. They may. There was a few years ago, there was what they called a cheap fake of I think she was Speaker of the House at the time, but it was Nancy Pelosi. Mm-hmm. And all they did was, somebody had done was slowed down the video and audio so it looked like she had been drinking. Yeah. And I remember seeing that on my Facebook feed, and a bunch of my friends going, "Can you believe this?" And I'm like, this doesn't seem right, And it's interesting that something as simple as that could create that kind of traction, but it does. It happens.
Yeah, that's for sure, and we're seeing that is certainly a worry among lawmakers and among security analysts who are looking at this 2024 election, which appears to be a very close one once again, with two very controversial leaders, and worried that the wrong amount of there's enough people see the wrong stuff and it can sway an election one way or the other. And so one of the things that lawmakers have said who are supporting this legislation is that they're looking to improve TikTok. They're not looking to ban TikTok from the United States. What they want them to separate from this Chinese-backed company and to continue operating here in the United States. And they're giving them a 6-month window in order to do that. So far, ByteDance, it sounds as though they are resisting the calls to do this. But let's say that they do divest from China. Does that make TikTok better? Does it make it safer? Does it do what lawmakers think that it's going to do?
That is an excellent question. And the answer to that is, I have no idea.
I thought you were going to say that.
Right. But here's what does happen. I know that in the defense industry, there are companies like, for example, BAE Systems, which is a big defense contractor globally. They are the result of a merger between two British companies, being Marconi and British Aerospace, and they came together and formed BAE Systems. And when that happened, actually before that happened, because Marconi had to do this, but they had operations in the United States. They had to establish a separate company called BAE North America, BAE Systems North America, which has different corporate leadership. And the rule is that nobody from the British ownership can just walk into the American owned buildings. But that rule is put in place by defense contracts, right? So if you're talking about the foreign ownership of a country or of a company that does business with the United States, there's an easy way to set up that kind of barrier. But if you're talking about essentially a completely private sector company that has no relationship with the U.S. government, there's no economic forces they can put in place via a contract vehicle or anything. The solution seems to be that they're going to legislate it. Now, I don't know if this is actually constitutional. In fact, Rand Paul was making a point about this. I saw recently, he was saying that this, we've never done this before. And the reason we've never done this before is because it's not constitutional to order a company to divest itself of its ownership. So I don't know if it's going to happen. I don't know if it's going to be successful. But even if it does happen, and it is successful from a business organization standpoint, there's still not a lot that says that data is still not going to make the trip to China where it's accessible to the CCP.
And I know a lot of TikTok defenders are saying just specifically focusing on TikTok distracts the fact from, and I think you were hitting this point a little bit earlier in the interview, that larger legislation needs to be put in place to get a hold on how much these social media companies are sharing information with third parties, and how easy it is for people to manipulate video and to do, like what you said, try and influence elections, try and widen the divide, the gap. And of course, the hearing that you were talking about was the Senate hearing on child sexual exploitation. So a lot of different areas where lawmakers, it seems, really are trying to get a handle on the influence and the scope of social media.
Right. And it's a huge problem. There are studies out there that talk about how bad social media is for young people, particularly for young girls. It is incredibly damaging to their psychological development as teenagers. It's not being a teenager is not the easiest thing in the world. I think back on that as being one of the most difficult times of my life. I don't know about you, John, but I didn't have a good time as a teenager. But I mean, there were certain parts that were fun, but it was there's a lot going on. These having all these extra psychological and social pressures amplified by these media platforms just has not been led to good outcomes for people. There was I don't remember the article off the top of my head, but I talked about it on my podcast called Hacking Humans. Plug that here. But there was a developer at Facebook or at Meta. No, is it Instagram? I think he was talking about Instagram. He or she, it didn't make clear. But the developer said, we have a way to identify these users who are under the age of 13, people we know are violating our terms of service by signing up for the platform before they're 13. And his comment was, or the developer's comment was, but you don't want to open that Pandora's box. And I was like, whoa, a Pandora's box that only lets out good things? That's, you mean you could actually keep these young people off of your platform? And you chose not to? You chose to ignore that? You could identify young people and you said, we're not going to do that. And I guarantee you that is not unique to Meta. That is all of these companies do this. I don't know if they had the cognizance that Meta is capable of possessing. They may have the cognizance of it, but it's again, it's all motivated by the advertising dollars. and there are advertisers willing to pay to have young eyes looking at the screen. Because if you think about the disposable, any money that a child has is essentially disposable income.
Mm-hmm.
A child doesn't have to pay a mortgage. They don't have to pay a car payment. They don't have to pay any of that stuff. They don't have the social burdens or the financial burdens that adults have. So their money is completely disposable, and advertisers really want to get at that money. So it's like this loop of toxicity here that just winds up feeding itself. I don't know if you could tell this, but I'm not a big fan of social media.
No, well, you're not alone.
Right.
And I will say TikTok is immensely popular among young people here in America, and they certainly have been making their voices heard in opposition to this idea. And again, nothing is happening for at least another 6 months, and
Right.
There is a possibility that it will stay. But even as President Biden has said he would sign legislation,
Sign the legislation, yeah.
His campaign still is using TikTok to try and reach some of these younger voters that are out there. And so
Right.
the legislation is uncertain. We don't know where it's going to end up in the House, in the Senate. They haven't brought it up, and it's not clear when they will, but it's out there. And certainly there are vocal opponents to this legislation, mostly young people who are using TikTok. So it's a very interesting situation, and we'll see how it all shakes out here over the next few months. In the meantime, Joe Kerrigan, Senior Security Engineer with Johns Hopkins University Information Security Institute. What's the name of your podcast again?
Excuse me. Hacking Humans.
Hacking Humans.
Yeah, we talk about social engineering attacks, which is the fancy. It's a terrible term. I don't like it. But it's the fancy term for scams, essentially. And these scams affect individuals. They affect companies. I didn't swallow that water correctly. Great. These scams affect individuals. They affect companies, and they're really one of the biggest vulnerabilities in the system is the humans behind the systems, the operators, because they can be tricked.
Absolutely. And obviously very, very interesting times that we are in right now with social media and technology and the like. So it sounds like a very good podcast for folks to be listening on. Joe, thank you so much for coming on this podcast, the DC Debrief. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.